Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Tuan, for your leadership on the Boston Global Forum. There are a variety of ways of approaching the topic this morning. I'm going to talk about the question of whether we can develop norms internationally to govern conflict in cyberspace. And basically, I'm going to this morning repeat in, I think Tuan said 20 minutes or less, the things that I said last week to the Chinese conference on the internet in Wuhan. I just got back from Beijing at 2 a.m. yesterday, so if I fall asleep in the middle of my talk, please forgive me. I'm permitted to, you're not. So what I talked about is normative restraints on cyber conflict. And I ask, where does the world stand in the development of norms to restrain conflict in cyberspace? I don't know if any of you have seen the new site that the Council on Foreign Relations and Adam Siegel has put up, trying to catalog the number of interstate attacks. And it's quite fascinating to look at the shape of the curve since about 2004, just has a steep upward slope if you go and consult that. The question, I think, of whether we can develop international agreements or norms to restrain cyber attacks by states. Remember, cyber attack is a very vague word and can refer to a wide range of things, but I'm talking about the use of cyber for malicious purpose by state actors. And I've tried to argue elsewhere in an article in the Strategic Studies Quarterly that states take a while to learn how to manage a new disruptive technology. And while nuclear technology is totally different from cyber technology, as somebody put it, nuclear technology can end the world while cyber technology can disrupt the world. There is some difference there, but that's not the point I want to make. What I want to make is a larger historical point, which is how do states learn when you have a very disruptive technology to essentially encompass it in a set of rules of the road or norms. And while the two technologies are vastly different, I think we can learn something about the process of how states learn to cope with highly disruptive technologies. And it's interesting if you look at how long it took states to learn to develop some norms to restrict nuclear technology. It was about 2 decades after Hiroshima before you saw any progress. And depending on how you count, we're somewhere in about the 2-decade mark in terms of cyber. Now you would say to me, whoa, that's terribly off because the origins of the internet go all the way back to late 60s and early 70s. But if you think about cyber as a security problem, it really becomes a major security problem at the end of the 1990s, when it becomes a basic substratum for economics and political relations. And you've all seen that famous hockey stick graph where, cyber uptake goes very slowly until you get the web, and after you get the web and browsers, it really takes off around 96, 97 and this is the famous hockey stick that we see. Now, with that enormous interdependence that comes with that interconnectedness, you find that interdependence produces huge benefits, but also huge vulnerabilities. And with vulnerabilities comes insecurity. So essentially, cyber, I would argue, is at about the same 2-decade mark in terms of being a major security problem. Now, if you look at the nuclear example, you will find that the first efforts to control this new nuclear technology were centered around major United Nations treaties. And incidentally, that's what the Russians and Chinese want today, a big UN treaty. Our lead in the 1940s meant that we proposed the treaty, and we proposed the Baruch Plan, where the UN would own and control nuclear technology, just as the Chinese and Russians want the International Telecommunications Union to have that kind of a role. Of course, the Russians turned that down. They weren't going to essentially give up the technology they were stealing from us through spies, and they wanted their own nuclear weapon. And so these efforts in the first decade, the UN-centered efforts were a failure. It really wasn't until after the fright that we induced in each other in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 that you got the beginnings of real efforts to set norms to surround this new disruptive technology. And the first was the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which you might note was a very limited thing, which was essentially an environmental treaty. It was a game against nature to prevent strontium-90 poisoning us all. And that was followed in 1968 with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which again was a game in which the U.S. and the Soviet Union cooperated against third parties, other countries developing weapons, rather than dealing directly with each other. So it really wasn't until the 70s, which is 30 years after Hiroshima, before you got strategic arms limitation talks, which is direct U.S.-Soviet negotiations, which produced something which began to set constraints on this new threatening technology. Now, what's interesting is that the parallel process is that China and other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Group have followed what Russia proposed in 1999, which is a full-fledged United Nations treaty, in their words, to ban electronic and information weapons. Electronic information weapons. Notice how broad that is. That would also include propaganda. It would include banning what the Russians just did in the American elections, if such a treaty had existed. The trouble with such a treaty, as the Americans pointed out, and had pointed out consistently since 1999, is it's totally unverifiable. It's a set of words that makes us feel good, but essentially which has almost no effect on real behavior. Instead, what the U.S. and other countries proposed, and that was agreed upon, was that the UN Secretary General should set up a group of governmental experts, the UNGGE, and it first met in 2004. Initially, it had very meager results. It didn't accomplish very much. But the interesting thing is that by July of 2015, it was able to issue a report in which the 15 members, or by then expanded to 20, were able to set an agreement or have a consensus on a set of processes and procedures which would set some limits on cyber attacks by states, particularly against critical infrastructure. What's interesting is that the report, the 2015 report of the UNGGE, was taken to the group of 20 most powerful economies in the world and was endorsed by the group of 20. Now, if you know anything about the way the UN works, the basement is full of rooms with groups of experts on this, that, and the other thing. And rarely does their product rise above the basement level. So it's quite remarkable that the UNGGE produced a report which was endorsed by the 20 most powerful economies in the world. But before you say, that was good news, they met again, and in 2017, this past summer, they failed to reach consensus. They expanded the group as more states demanded to be parts of it. With the expansion, it was more difficult to have consensus. In addition to that, there were deep problems in the political relationship between the United States and Russia in the aftermath of the Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And China began to backtrack because China has the feeling that the internet should be subject to sovereign controls. And so China worried a little bit that in signing on to the 2015 report, it was weakening this new strengthened position that takes China's traditional position and sort of doubles it or squares it, if you want, which is the Xi Jinping regime is trying to have tighter and tighter party control of everything in China, including the internet. So 2017, the UNGGE fails to continue the progress that it had initially shown in its report on 2015. Now, to understand the GGE, it helps to put it in the broader context of normative constraints on states. We often think about international law, and the Tallinn Manual is an effort by a group of international lawyers to write down what is agreed to be international law and how it applies to the internet. There's still a disagreement among lawyers about some of the clauses and things in the Tallinn Manual, but it would be a pity if we restrained our imagination to efforts to have interstate control or setting up rules of the road for the internet if we just restricted ourselves to binding international law. As Martha Finnemore and Duncan Hollis have argued in a recent paper called Constructing Norms for Global Cybersecurity, a norm is a collective expectation of proper behavior of actors with a given identity. And norms apply to multiple actors, and they're not legally binding. In that sense, they're different from international law. So if you think about the different types of normative constraints on states, you can imagine formal interstate agreements, international law, which take the form of either treaties or have evolved over time to be what's called customary international law. But there's also practice, common practices, which become norms in the sense of expected collective behavior. And then there are also sort of codes and rules of the road for conduct. So there are different degrees of formalism in the normative constraints we can imagine. So if you think of formal agreements, you would think of a treaty. If you think of common practices that make the internet work, it might be routing practices and exchanges, border gateway protocols and so forth. Or you could look at the name system. And these are practices which make things work. And then you have sort of efforts to develop codes or rules of the road, and that's where the GGE came in, which was to try to create a code or norm which said you will not attack critical infrastructure and you will not interfere with each other's certs as they try to understand attacks and problems. Notice what I've restricted myself to so far is different degrees of formalism in the normative constraints, but they're all at the global level. What I'm arguing is that in the aftermath of the failure of the GGE this past summer, that we ought to think about different levels of agreement in terms of their scope. So think of a matrix in addition to formalism, which I've described. You can also think of different degrees of inclusiveness, and you can have global, which I've described so far. You can also have plurilateral and regional. There's not all states, but some states sometimes. And you can also have, below that, pure bilateral agreements. If you put those together, formal agreements, common practices, norms, and codes with degrees of formalism, with global, plurilateral, and bilateral as different degrees of inclusiveness, you obviously get a simple 9-cell matrix. And only one cell of that matrix is the UN GGE, acting at the global level. And we should not let the failure of the GGE deter us from realizing that there are 8 other venues where, in this matrix, where we can be trying to develop rules of the road or normative restraints on state conflict. To give some examples, on plurilateral and regional type disputes, you have the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which is not universal, but it starts in Europe, but it has now adherence to other like-minded states on criminal aspects. Along with that, in practice, you have the cooperation that's developing in Europol and Interpol on crime issues. On common practices, you might see something like codes of conduct among like-minded states. So if you ask, could we get a declaration of internet freedom, which is universal, that there is a right to communicate universally, some people call it a universal right within the context of the UN Convention on Human Rights. Chances of China or Russia signing on to something like that are, if not zero, asymptotic to zero. I mean, it's just not going to happen. But could you imagine Brazil and India and Australia and Japan joining with Europe, with us, to say that we should make sure that the internet stays open to the extent that we're able to? Yes, and then you would face people say, but that's fragmentation of the internet. Well, I hate to tell you, but the internet is already fragmented. Anybody who thinks there's a global universal internet hasn't been to China lately, as I just came back from there. And the internet is not universally open. But you could imagine a set of very significant states representing a large portion of the world economy taking a position of self-restraint on rules of the road to keep a degree of openness. And when you come to norms and codes at the plurilateral and regional level, you can imagine organizations like ASEAN and other regional organizations trying to do something similar. And finally, at the bottom of my 3 levels of inclusiveness are bilateral agreements. And you can say, well, what's the value of bilateral agreements? I mean, just 2 states. How does that affect international norms and constraints? Well, let's think about the case of the U.S. and China for a minute. Remember, I said that the U.S. and China have had very different differences, very important differences on rules for the internet. I just cited one about freedom of speech or content control. But let me give you another example, which is for years the United States complained bitterly to the Chinese that their use of cyber espionage to steal intellectual property from American companies and deliver it to Chinese companies was outrageous. And the Chinese reply was, look, you're spying on us all the time by cyber means, so what if we do something? First we deny we do it. And then the standard procedure is, having denied we did it, we said, you do it too. So, and that, Xi Jinping and Obama met at Sunnylands in California in 2013, and that issue was top of the priority for the United States at the meeting. And then the Snowden affair occurred. Well, the Snowden affair let China off the hook. All the Chinese wanted to talk about was the evils of the United States as revealed by Snowden, so they totally dropped this. Then the United States basically said, we're serious. We had the indictment of 5 PLA officers. We had an executive order in the spring of 2015 saying that we were going to impose sanctions against companies that stole or took possession of stolen intellectual property. And the first reaction of the Chinese to this was to break the arrangements that had been made to have a relatively low-level cyber consultative group. Chris Pater chaired it on our side for the State Department, and the Chinese said, we pull out of that. You know, you indict our officers even if they're never going to go to jail here. It's an affront to us, and we're breaking our cooperative relations in cyber. And then the United States said, you know, there's a summit coming up in September 2015, and if you want this summit to succeed, we're going back to 2013 and what we put on the table. We are sick and tired of you using cyber espionage to steal intellectual property to transfer to your companies. It's corrupting the level playing field or the degree of fairness that we expect in the international trading system. You know, it's one thing to have espionage. We all do it all the time, all states. But the idea that you corrupt the trade system by this type of theft is unfair. And it's different than the traditional form of stealing commercial proprietary secrets, because it's quick, it's cheap, and it's more plausibly deniable. So you say, what's new? What's new is you send an electron across the border, you don't have to train the electron, you don't have to worry about your spy being caught with a briefcase full of documents and so forth. So the American position was, if you want a successful summit, you have to agree to stop this. And lo and behold, when Xi Jinping and Obama met in September of 2015, the Chinese reversed their declaratory policy 180 degrees. And they agreed that they would indeed not use cyber espionage for theft of intellectual property. And as far as I'm able to discern from talking to both government officials and officials of companies like FireEye and so forth, that's been largely observed by the Chinese. There's some cases at the margins where people say, oh, this is outside the bounds and so forth. But there has been a discernible change in Chinese behavior. Now, just to conclude this, what's interesting is that this bilateral agreement didn't stay in this little box of the 9-fold matrix called bilateral. It was essentially taken by China and the U.S. to the group of 20, and there it was endorsed by a much broader set of states. So it became the core or the kernel of a broader framework of agreement about norms and constraints on one dimension of cyber conflict, which is using cyber espionage for theft of intellectual property. Now, that doesn't mean that that problem is solved or that cyber conflict is solved, but it does illustrate that when we look at the failure of the GGE last summer, which is in this cell of the matrix, which is broad global agreements, that you can accomplish things in other areas, whether it be multilaterally or plurilaterally among like-minded states, or whether it be among states with very, very different views of the internet, such as the US and China at the bilateral level, but having reached a common interest, they can then begin to generalize it to broader sets of states. I suspect that's the way progress is going to be made. It's not going to be made by some large UN agreement. It's not going to be made by reconvening the UNGGE at let's say 40 states or 70 states, as some people have talked about. I think that would be a recipe for basically burying the efforts to develop meaningful cyber norms, but finding ways in which states can negotiate their concrete interests and then broaden that from a bilateral or small group to something which other states can sign on to, strikes me as a much more plausible approach that we should be following as we look toward creating normative restraints on states in the future. Now, to conclude, there's an interesting question, which is, could you imagine doing this with Russia on the issue of interference in each other's election campaigns? After the Russian events of the Russian interference in 2016, and I should point out that information warfare interfering in elections is not new. Americans have done it in the Cold War. Other Russians have done it with other countries. What's new, again, is how quick and easy and deniable it is. So it's a little bit like the point of intellectual property theft by cyber means. It's not that it's totally new. It's that it's a technology has made something which just grows exponentially in terms of problem of relations. So could you imagine, in analogy to what I said about how we work step by step from first an environmental treaty in the nuclear area, the test ban, atmospheric test ban, to a non-proliferation treaty which was aimed at third parties, other states, to direct bilateral restraints among countries which were bitter antagonists, the United States and the Soviet Union, but we were able to get the SALT agreements. And the question is, in the cyber area, is it plausible to imagine doing with the Russians on interference with each other's elections something similar to what we did with the Chinese on theft of intellectual property? And before we conclude yes, I should point out to you it's going to be much harder. The relationship between the United States and Russia is much more fraught than it is with China. After all, there is a massive economic interdependence with China, or entanglement. And the other problem, of course, is that how would you verify this? The United States had a list of 16 critical infrastructures. So the GGE rules were supposed to prevent interference with critical infrastructures. The United States, after the 2016 election, added a 17th critical infrastructure, which was the electoral system. Is it plausible that we and the Russians could sit down and get some sort of negotiation in that area? I think the odds are low, but I think it's still worth a try. So that's my effort to try to portray for you what I said in China last week, which is that despite the failure of the UNGG this summer, efforts to create normative restraints on cyber conflict among states is not dead, and there are many other avenues where we should be trying to proceed besides the UNGG. Thank you.